The elevator doors slid open with a smooth, metallic hum, and Catherine Hale, the city's most commanding CEO, stepped inside, her presence as sharp as the click of her polished heels. Her leather portfolio, embossed with her initials, gleamed under the sterile fluorescent lights, a symbol of her iron grip on the corporate world. Her mind was already racing, board meetings stacked like skyscrapers, urgent calls buzzing like static, and investors circling with demands that grew hungrier by the day. It was just another morning in her empire, where every second was a calculated move toward greater power. But this elevator ride, this fleeting moment in a steel box, was about to unravel everything she thought she knew. As the doors began to close with a soft whir, a small figure darted through the narrowing gap, a young boy, no older than 10, his sneakers scuffed and laces flapping loose. He nearly tripped in his haste, clutching the faded sleeve of his father's uniform. The man, the building's night janitor, was someone Catherine had passed countless times without a second glance, his presence as invisible to her as the hum of the air conditioning. The boy's eyes, wide and bright with a mix of awe and urgency, locked onto her as he whispered something to his father, his voice too low to catch. Then, in a moment that sliced through the air like a lightning bolt, he turned to Catherine and said, with a firmness that belied his age, "Don't talk." The words hung heavy, a command so bold it stunned her. Catherine, whose voice could silence boardrooms and sway markets, blinked, her polished exterior cracked by the sheer audacity. "Excuse me," she said, her tone teetering between indignation and curiosity, her perfectly arched brow rising. The boy didn't flinch. He pressed a finger to his lips, shaking his head with a quiet intensity that made her pause. His father, red-faced and flustered, stammered, "I'm so sorry, Mom. He didn't mean it, please, forgive him." But the boy tugged at his father's sleeve, his voice insistent. "Dad, no. She can't talk. Please." Catherine's first instinct was to demand an explanation, to assert the authority that had carried her to the top of the city's power structure. Her days were spent commanding, negotiating, winning. Silence was not in her playbook. Yet something in the boy's eyes, a desperate glint that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears, stopped her cold. For the first time in years, Catherine Hale held her tongue. The elevator hummed upward, the digital display ticking off floors, 7, 8, 9, each number glowing in the quiet. The boy stood tense, his small frame rigid, his gaze darting between his father and Catherine as if her silence was a lifeline. The air grew thick, the kind of heavy stillness that presses against your chest. Catherine's mind raced, piecing together the oddity of the moment, but she stayed quiet, honoring the boy's plea for reasons she couldn't yet grasp. Then, as the elevator reached the 15th floor, a harsh screech erupted from the shaft, like metal clawing against metal. The lights flickered, plunging them into a heartbeat of darkness before stuttering back on. The elevator jolted violently, then stopped, frozen between floors. Catherine's pulse spiked as she gripped the polished railing, her knuckles whitening. The janitor gasped, a sharp, ragged sound, and staggered against the wall, his hand clutching his chest. But the boy, unshaken, closed his eyes and whispered, "It's okay. Just don't talk. Please." Confusion swirled through Catherine's mind, a storm of questions she couldn't voice. Why silence? Why now? Her instincts screamed to act, to take control, to press the emergency button glowing red on the panel. She reached for it, her hand steady despite the chaos, but the boy's small fingers shot out, covering hers. "Shh," he begged, his voice trembling, tears glistening in his eyes. "Noise makes it worse for him." Then she saw it, the janitor's face, pale and slick with sweat, his breathing shallow and uneven, his hand pressed hard against his chest as if trying to hold himself together. He was having an attack, a medical emergency unfolding in the confines of this stalled steel box. Catherine's heart lurched, her CEO composure fracturing. "He needs help," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but the boy shook his head, his tears spilling over. "If people yell, it'll get worse. The doctor said he needs calm. Silence helps him breathe." In that instant, clarity hit her like a tidal wave. The boy wasn't being rude or defiant, he was fighting to save his father's life. The weight of his words, his desperate plea for silence, wasn't about disrespect but about survival. Catherine's world, built on power plays and calculated risks, shrank to the size of this elevator, where a child's courage outshone her empire. She knelt beside the janitor, her tailored suit brushing the floor, and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're safe," she said softly, her voice a quiet anchor in the storm. "We'll get you through this." The boy fumbled with his worn backpack, pulling out a crumpled paper bag. "Here, Dad," he whispered, pressing it to his father's mouth. "Slow breaths, remember." Catherine's hands, usually reserved for signing multi-million-dollar deals, steadied the bag, her touch careful but firm. Together, she and the boy counted softly, their voices barely above a whisper, 1 breath, 2 breaths, 3, guiding the janitor through the panic. His trembling eased, his breaths growing steadier, deeper, the color creeping back into his face. The elevator remained still, but the air felt lighter, the crisis loosening its grip. Minutes stretched like hours, but finally, the elevator shuddered back to life with a groan. The doors slid open on the 16th floor, revealing a small crowd of paramedics and security staff, alerted by the building's system that had flagged the stall. The janitor was guided to a bench just outside, his breathing now stable, his son's hand clasped tightly in his. Catherine stayed close, her usual instinct to rush to her next meeting replaced by something deeper, something human. She knelt in front of the boy, her eyes level with his. "You were incredible," she said, her voice warm with awe. "You knew exactly what to do. You saved your dad." The boy wiped his tears with the back of his hand, his voice small but steady. "I just didn't want him to die. He always tells me, if anything happens, stay calm. Don't let people panic. Noise makes it worse." Catherine's throat tightened. For years, she'd walked past the janitors, cleaners, and security guards, the invisible gears of her corporate machine, without a second thought. Yet here, in this stalled elevator, a child had shown her a truth she'd forgotten: every life, no matter how overlooked, carried immeasurable value. The next morning, Catherine sat at her desk, the city skyline sprawling beyond her office window, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought of the boy's courage, his father's quiet resilience, and her own blindness to the people who kept her world running. She made a call, her voice steady but softer than usual, and set in motion a new healthcare program for every janitor, cleaner, and security guard in her company. It wasn't a grand gesture meant for headlines, it was a quiet promise to see the unseen, to honor the humanity she'd ignored for too long. It wouldn't erase years of indifference, but it was a start, a seed planted in the wake of a lesson she'd never forget. Weeks later, Catherine visited the janitor and his son in their modest apartment, a far cry from her penthouse office. The man stood taller, his health restored, gratitude radiating from his eyes. The boy, no longer trembling, ran up and hugged her without hesitation. "Thank you for listening," he said, his voice bright with sincerity. Catherine smiled, her heart fuller than any boardroom victory had ever left her. "No, thank you," she replied. "You reminded me that the greatest lessons don't come from power or wealth, they come from courage and love." As she walked back to her office, the city's pulse humming around her, Catherine realized that a single whispered command, "Don't talk," had spoken louder than any deal she'd closed or speech she'd given. It was a story she knew needed to be shared, a tale of humanity that could inspire others. She thought of MidnightTales, her favorite YouTube channel, where stories of heart and heroism found a home. She imagined this moment, this elevator ride, being told under the channel's evocative glow, reaching thousands, maybe millions, with its message: true leadership isn't about commanding a room, it's about listening, caring, and seeing the worth in every soul. The boy's voice echoed in her mind as she stepped into her office, the weight of her portfolio lighter than ever. She wasn't just a CEO anymore, she was a student of a lesson taught by a child, one that reshaped her world. And as she sat down, her gaze drifting to the city below, she knew she'd carried that lesson forever. Compassion, humility, and the quiet power of a single moment could change everything.